Hey everyone, just a few quick things before we get started. Don't forget to sign the attendance sheet. It's just real simple. Just ask you 2 questions. Kind of looks like this. But that's pretty much it. Please enjoy. Hope you all learn something.
Okay, so in today's video, we're going to be going over variables and data types. My office hours are right up here. They're also posted on Moodle. If you have any questions about anything I say or anything else, you can come stop by, like virtually. But let's get started. Okay, so the first question I have is, what is a variable in a computer science sense? So, a variable represents a known in a computer science sense. In math, variables can represent like unknowns, right, if you're solving for x, but in computer science, variables are almost always known, or you can't use them without them really being known. And an important thing to note about computer science variables is that they can be changed and altered. As the program continues. And it will still be the same variable. So, like if you can have like a variable x and you have it be equal to 1, and then a few lines later you can change it to be equal to 2, and it could still be called the variable x. So the next question I have is list the different types of data types, or the different types of variables you can have. And so to start this off, we're gonna start off with int, or an integer. This is probably one of the most common data types you can have. And it just represents, like an integer, it represents a whole number, so you can't have any decimals. Whoops, misspelled that. Okay. The next data type that we have is double. So whereas an integer can only represent a whole number, doubles represent numbers with decimals. So like, 6.3, something like that. Okay, we also have a float. So a float is kind of like a double. So it represents numbers with decimals. So double has what they call a double precision, which is probably why it's called double. Whereas a float only has a single precision. And so this just means that a double is going to be able to handle like a bigger number than a float. We also have a bool. So a bool is a unique type of variable. It doesn't represent numbers. It represents true or false. But also this can be represented with numbers. So it represents true or false either with the words true or false. So I'll just put these in quotes. Or you can also represent it with 1 for true and 0 for false. Alright, next up we got a char variable. So a char represents a single character. So this can either be a digit like 7 or 4, or it can be a letter like A or B. It can also be a like a legitimate character, like a question mark, or a hyphen, or whatever you want it to be. But it can only be one. Alright, so after that we got string. And so this is going to be similar to char, but instead of a single character, it's multiple characters. So you can have like a whole sentence or just a word or anything you can do. You can even put a single character in string if you wanted. Alright, last but not least, we have a long variable. And this is less of a standalone. It's more like a long int or a long double. So we'll put like long int / long double. Okay, so this is actually more of a data type modifier, and there are a few others. So like, see how it's a long int or a long double? So like the data types are int and doubles. But this is one of the more popular data type modifiers. They also have short ints or doubles, or unsigned or signed. It just gives a little more clarification on what the data type will be holding. But yeah, these are the different data types that you can use within your code. Alright, so the next question I have is, how do you declare a variable? So let's say we want to declare a variable x, and we want to make it an integer. So to declare a variable, the first thing we have to do is type the data type. So if we're doing an x that's an integer, we can start off with int, and then now we gotta type the variable name, so x, and then a semicolon. So this is just plain simple declaring a variable. And so the next question is, what's the difference between declaring a variable and initializing a variable? Okay, and so as you can see in the question above, we just declared a variable. And so if you're wondering like, well, what's x equal to? Well, that's what we're going to be doing right now. So declaring a variable, so it just creates the variable. So it's kind of like saying, it's kind of like if you were giving a gift to somebody and you're like, hey, I have a gift for you, and they're like, what is it? And you're like, oh, you don't know that, I don't know that yet. Right? So it's just saying that you have something, but the value is unknown. Now, you won't be able to use a variable really unless you give it a value first. So initializing a variable, creates and defines the variable. So if we were going back to the gift, it's like saying, oh, hey, I have a gift for you. And they were like, what is it? Oh, it's an apple, you know? So it's like saying that you have something and you're telling it what it is. So when you're declaring a variable, you're just telling the computer, hey, I have a variable called x. And the computer, and when you're initializing it, you're like, hey, I have a variable called x and it's equal to 5. So the value is known in initializing. Okay, so how do you initialize a variable? Well, we said it's almost essentially like declaring it, right? So we'll start off with how we would declare a variable. So int x, and let's say we want it to be equal to 5. So, we'll just equal 5. And that's how you initialize a variable. Easy peasy. Okay, so the next question is, what are the variable name rules? So the first rule is that you cannot start a variable with a number. The second rule is that variables cannot have special characters in them except for an underscore. And this is not necessarily, those last one's not necessarily a rule, it's more of a you really need to know this, but capitals matter. If you have a variable called cake and you have another variable called cake, these are going to be two separate variables. So cake with a capital C is going to be completely different from cake with a lowercase c. So just be warned of that. Okay? So the next questions I have is we're going to list these as either valid or invalid. So we can see here it has a capital S and it has a underscore at the end. But by these rules, we should know that this is valid, right? Because capitals are okay, but this is just going to be different from the same variable with a lowercase s. And underscores are also okay. They're the one exception to the rule. Alright, so candle. Capital C and has an exclamation point at the end. This is going to be invalid. The exclamation point cannot exist in a variable. That is what makes it invalid. Okay, so the next variable I have candy cane. And you may be thinking, oh, well, there's nothing really wrong with that. But it is invalid because of the space. So it is invalid because of the space in between it. You cannot have a space in a variable. You need to have like an underscore or something. I can't really highlight the space red, so just kind of remember that's it. And this is underscore cherry. So this one is actually going to be valid. There's no rule against starting a variable with a special character as an underscore. The underscore special character. Alright, and then we got 3 nights. This one is going to be invalid, right? Can't start a variable with a number. Alright, next we have puppies 8. Capital P and A at the end. And this will be valid. It has a number, but that's okay as long as it's not starting with a number and it doesn't have any special characters. Okay, so now we can move on. And it says, next question I have is, what do you need when you're using strings? Okay, so if we remember from earlier, strings is the variable that has multiple characters. So C++ doesn't actually come with this type of variable by default. You have to include a library, like I mentioned in the last video. So we do that by doing hashtag include less than sign. So the library is just called string, and you can do a greater than sign. And so this is all you need to do when you're using strings. But if you forget this, then none of your strings will work, and you may be very confused as to what's happening in your code. Okay, let me highlight what made that invalid. Okay, and then I'll just, you know what, I'll just do this. The space makes it invalid. Yeah, so remember, when you're just using strings, just put that string library in there, so hashtag include string, and then you should be all good to go. Okay, so the next question is, what do you use when declaring a char versus a string? So when you're doing a char, so let's say we wanted char we're gonna do like last initial, and then we're gonna set it equal to my last initial is D, so we're just gonna use that. But when you're using a char, you have to do a single quote, then whatever you want to put, and then close the quote, and obviously a semicolon. But when we're doing a string, so string, we'll do last name. Alright, my last name is DHard, so we're just going to pretend like we're using that. So while a char gets a single quote, a string gets a double quote. Alright, so char, single quotes, string, double quotes. It won't compile properly if you get them mixed up. Okay, so what's the scope of a variable and how do we find it? So, the scope of a variable is where the variable is defined. Okay, so what this means is it's also where the variable will work. Because if you use a variable outside a place where it's defined, it won't really work. It'll say that the variable's been undefined. So we find it. So there's a trick to finding where a variable is defined. A variable is defined within the nearest brackets. So let's say you had main backup, so we have int main, and if we were doing this right, we'd have like all the stuff at the top too. But we have main right now, and let's say we have int x is equal to 5. So within this case, x is going to be valid from that bracket to this bracket. You can't use it if it hasn't been defined beforehand. Like if I tried to use x here, like if I was like, c out x, you can't do that because it hasn't been defined yet. But for the most part, it's going to be defined with whatever brackets it's in. Later, when you get to different stuff, there will be more brackets, and I'll go over that again just to kind of show you where it's defined. But it's going to be where after it's been initialized and then down to the last bracket. So I'll just kind of put that there for you. Okay. The next question I have is, what can you use to find the size of a variable? So they actually have this very helpful function. To find the size of a variable, all you need to do is type size of. Okay, and then of course inside your parentheses is where the variable goes. But size of returns the bits. It does not return like if you had a string of, and it said hello, HELLO, 5 letters. It wouldn't return 5, it would return whatever the bit size is of a string variable. So just be aware of that. Okay, so the next question is, how do you change a variable type? So this one is going to be a little more difficult to remember, but not quite hard. So you're going to want to start off with static underscore cast. Then the data type you want to change it to. So I'm just going to put like data type like this, okay? And then the value you want to change in parentheses. So it goes static cast, and then in the less than or greater sign, it goes data type, the data type you want to change it to, and then the value you want to change. And of course like that. Well, depending on where you have it in your code. But let's say we had an integer x equals 5. If we want to change it to a double, we could do static underscore cast double x. And so this would then change x to a double. Okay, so I actually had to add a question because I realized I forgot to go over something. So this added question is, what is a constant variable? So a constant variable is a variable that cannot be changed. So unlike regular variables, if you label something as a constant, you cannot change it. So to do that, all we have to do is type const and then whatever variable we want. Okay, so let's pretend like we're gonna try to define the constant like for like gravity, right? Let's say we need it for some reason. So you can do a const double, and we'll call it gravity. and we can set that equal to 9.81. And so what this does is it makes this gravity, which is a double variable, it makes it constantly 9.81. It cannot be changed, and no matter what happens to the code, it will remain unchanged. Okay, so now we can move on to coding. I have a real simple code for us to start. It's writing everything we need to start the program, declaring a few variables, declaring a constant, and then setting some variables equal to stuff. So I opened up online GDB, and so what we're going to do is we're going to start by writing everything we need to start a program. So let's go down line by line. First thing is hashtag include iostream. Next is using namespace std. Next is int main parentheses brackets, and then we can put a return 0 if we want at the bottom. Alright, so now we have our function all set up, our code all set up. So let's start with other stuff. So the first thing it wants us to do is declare these variables. So we need an integer x as 10. So int x is equal to 10, semicolon. Next we want a double y. So double y as 5.0, semicolon. And then we need another integer z as 6. And okay, so I have a bool x even. So type bool and then the variable name. And it doesn't say what it wants us to give it, so we're just gonna declare it and not initialize it. So we're gonna just leave it without a value. And then it wants us to do a char called first letter, and it wants us to initialize it as a. And so remember, with chars, they get the single quotes, not the double quotes, semicolon. Alright, and then a string word is an alphabet. So I see the word string, so we immediately need to go back up top and add our include. Right, and that's all you need to do. So now we can go back down and we can do string word is equal to alphabet. And so, like I said earlier, strings take double quotes. So alphabet, semicolon. Alright, great. We've declared all those variables. So now we're going to declare a constant that is equal to 3.14, right? So we can do const double, because it's a decimal, right? And then it's pi, so I'm just going to label it as pi. And we set that equal to 3.14. That's, okay, 4. And then semicolon. And so now, even if you try to change that, you won't be able to. Alright, and now it wants us to set the bool earlier that we declared earlier but didn't initialize to true. So when you're using a variable again after you initialize it, you just need to call it by the name. So we can just do x even is equal to true. And so like I said, you could also have done 1, but true is fine. Okay, and this is just how you code in a bunch of variables. If you have any questions about anything that I said, come feel free to stop by my office hours, but other than that, thanks for watching.
Thank you all for making it all the way through this video. Here's a little way of saying thank you.